The topic of my talk today, as you can see on the slide, is titled The Dynamics of the Indo-Pacific Region, the Challenges and Opportunities for Japan. I would like to give you my main points today, the main arguments that I would like to make today. And I would summarize my main points in three major themes. Point number one, there is this emerging concept, geographic concept called the Indo-Pacific region. And I think this region foresees a vast opportunity for economic growth and development, as major economies like Japan, the United States, and China are all poised to engage the region. So they are very much interested in trying to advance economic development in the Indo-Pacific region. This is my first point. My second point is that in order to keep the Indo-Pacific region's positive trajectory, that is economic development, I think there are two things that are necessary. Number one, we must forge interstate relations built upon what I call a rules-based order. Rules-based order. I will elaborate on what this means later on. Second thing that is necessary to keep the region on a positive trajectory is minimizing security risks in the region. And there are many security risks in the Indo-Pacific region, but I will today focus on the East Asian security risks that have implications beyond East Asia. What I mean by this is that security risks emanating from countries like North Korea and China could potentially have disruptive effect upon the region-wide economic development. This is my second point. My third point is that given this strategic environment, Japan faces three fundamental challenges. Number one, we have to encourage the Trump administration to pursue a region-wide engagement through the free and open Indo-Pacific framework, meaning that we want to see the United States play a more stabilizing role in the region. Secondly, one of the security risks in East Asia is actually coming from China. And one of the things that Japan would like to do is to try to persuade and induce China to abide by international rules and norms upon exercising power in the region. And thirdly, this is one of the pressing issues, but we want to compel North Korea, together with other countries in the world, to completely and irreversibly dismantle its nuclear weapons program and comply with United Nations Security Council resolutions. So these are the main points that I would like to make, and in the subsequent time frame, I would like to expand and elaborate on these three lines of argument. So beginning with the opportunities of the Indo-Pacific region. As you can see on the map, when you look at the prospects for economic development in the Indo-Pacific region, which you can see, different regions are expected to achieve different rates of economic growth. These are figures from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, World Economic Outlook database. But as you can see, East Asia last year achieved 5.4% of economic growth and is expected to achieve something like 4.7% in 2022, which is 5 years or 4 years from now. Slight reduction in economic growth rate. However, East Asia will still grow at a fairly significant rate at 4.7%. When you look at South Asia, last year it was 6.6%, and in 2022 it is expected to achieve something like 7.8%, which is very, very impressive. I think very high rate of economic growth is probably be driven by countries like India and so forth. And also in the Middle East, last year the economic growth rate was 1.3%, but is expected to grow to 3.0%. And for North Africa, it has already achieved quite strong economic growth by 4.8%, and it's expected to retain that growth rate even in 2022 at 4.8%. So as you can see from these statistics, the economic forecast by the IMF shows that the Indo-Pacific region is expected to continue growing at a very significant rate. And there are promises of economic growth in the region. Another point that I would like to mention with regard to this map is that one of the significant features of the past one year or so is that major countries, countries like China, the United States, and Japan, have all launched or announced major grand strategic engagement plans to engage this Indo-Pacific region. As you know, China has already announced its One Belt, One Road initiative, or Belt and Road initiative these days, and is expected to invest in many of the infrastructure projects scattered all over the region. Also, Japan and the United States, and also Australia, have all announced or made clear their intention to engage this region economically through this new free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So as you can see, there is this very positive momentum toward advancing very powerful economic growth in the region, which I think is a very, very positive development over the past several years. So, as you can see, this region is endowed with economic vitality, economic activeness. And this is generated by rising economies like India, Southeast Asia, and African states. And it's also driven by large economies like China, and also advanced economies like Japan, South Korea, and the United States. So one of the questions, strategic questions that need to be addressed is how do you keep this positive trajectory? How do you keep economic development and economic growth in the region? And one of the prerequisites or the very important conditions necessary to sustain stable economic growth is what we call rules-based order, or international rules and norms. Stable economic activity and transaction can be realized on the basis of a stable regional order underpinned or sustained by shared rules and norms. Now, when I talk about rules and norms, these are, as you know, regulations that essentially control or regulate the exercise of power by states. So if you accept international rules and norms, you behave in a certain way that are stipulated in those international rules and norms. And if rules and norms are shared, they generate a pattern of behavior, and also they generate expectation for rule-compliant behavior. So what you get is predictability and stability. For example, in any country we have domestic law, many domestic law. And if everyone is complying, most of the population is complying with law, you have order. And order creates stability and predictability. And I think in order to continue economic growth, what you need is a very stable order that is sustained by shared rules and norms. This is very important, I think. We normally take for granted many of these rules and norms, but I think trying to agree and adopt and absorb common rules and norms is a fundamental condition that is necessary to keep the region on a positive economic trajectory. If there is less rules and norms, meaning that if countries cannot agree to common rules and norms, then interstate relations are likely to be governed more by power, meaning that the stronger country will dictate the outcome of international interactions. And this is not something that Japan would like to see happen. I don't think many countries in the world would like to see a power-based order. Exercise of naked power by a major power against small and medium-sized power is something that we, as human beings, have been trying to overcome in the past history. And I think the cause for human progress requires the proliferation of shared rules and norms. And this is one of the major strategic goals of Japan, to advance a rules-based order. So, having taken this into account, prosperity of the region will depend on several important factors when it comes to order. Number one, free and open maritime order that will allow the free flow of lawful commerce. If all the countries are able to freely use the seas, I think commerce is likely to flourish even more. That is what I mean by open and free maritime order. Second, enhanced connectivity that will enable the large flow of lawful commerce. What do I mean by connectivity? This is about ports and roads and pipelines, all the infrastructure that is required to send goods throughout the region. I think commerce, manufacturing of goods, exports and imports will depend largely on transportation infrastructure and connectivity of various kinds. And I think this is very, very important to sustain economic growth in the region. And thirdly, of course, we need peace and security that will provide stable flow of lawful commerce. So, free and open maritime order, enhanced connectivity, and peace and security. These are three fundamental conditions that are probably required to keep the positive economic development of the region. So, Japan is now, in order to kind of create this kind of condition in the Indo-Pacific region, the Japanese government is now trying to advance this strategy that has been termed free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. This concept was originally advocated by Prime Minister Abe, our Prime Minister, back in 2007, during the first term of the Abe government, in the context of development assistance. But it was revived in his second term, most recently in his speech at TICAD, Tokyo International Conference on African Development, back in August 2016. And the basic idea is to connect Asia and Africa through this Indo-Pacific region to realize economic growth and development in the region. And there are two fundamental goals that I mentioned earlier. One is to nurture an open maritime order based on rule of law. And secondly, to foster and bolster economic development in the Indo-Pacific region. And I have to point out that sometimes people think this Indo-Pacific strategy framework as a competitive strategy or containment strategy against China, but it is not. It is not a containment strategy. It is an inclusive framework that will allow all the countries in the world who share the cause of stable economic growth to join this cooperation initiative. So as you can see, this is sort of a notional map of the free and open Indo-Pacific region. And this free and Indo-Pacific strategy has three pillars. Number one is the promotion and establishment of rule of law, freedom of navigation, and etc. So these are international rules and norms that we want to promote. That's pillar number one. Pillar number two is the pursuit of economic prosperity, improving connectivity, which is like building ports and roads and various kinds of infrastructure that will allow commerce to flourish in this region. And thirdly, the commitment for peace and stability. This includes efforts like capacity building for maritime security. So countries that wants to have coast guards, for example. Japan is trying to provide cutters, ships for maritime law enforcement, and also training for that purpose as well. And also, you will see this term, HADR Corporation. I'm sorry, this is an acronym for Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief. Japan suffered from earthquake and tsunami back in 2011. And we have a lot of experience in terms of managing disasters and dealing with humanitarian assistance. This is also a line of effort that Japan is advancing in the area of peace and security. And what we want to do is to sort of advance these three efforts in the region together with other countries. Not only with the major countries, but also with all the countries that are interested in connecting their economies to the Indo-Pacific region. So right now, what Japan is doing is it is actively developing cooperation with the United States and China, on the one hand. So with the United States is already, together with Japan, we are cooperating on development assistance. What we are doing is basically infrastructure investment. And some of the authorities from Japan and the United States have concluded agreements to jointly advance infrastructure investment projects in the Indo-Pacific region. This is one new development that is unfolding right now. And number two, Japan and China is also trying to cooperate for the purpose of infrastructure development. The Japanese government has devised a guideline to cooperate with China on certain issues like energy efficiency, industrialization, and development of solar energy, and high efficiency gas and coal power generation. So energy cooperation is another area where Japan and China is trying to cooperate right now. So Japan, as you can see, is trying to cooperate with not only with the United States, but also with China to advance infrastructure development and energy efficiency and energy cooperation in this area. So, there is this new opportunity, and Japan is trying very hard to try to sustain and support economic development in the Indo-Pacific region. However, in recent years, there has been new development that have been working adversely or against this positive trend. There are security risks in East Asia. One of the security risks is that the United States is becoming increasingly narrow-focused on a very narrow set of issues. In Asia, this is basically about North Korea and trade. The United States is only concentrating on North Korean trade. This is worrisome for us. Secondly, countries like China, Russia, North Korea, and terrorist criminal organizations have been violating fundamental rules and norms, such as peaceful resolution of disputes, nuclear non-proliferation, and counterterrorism. So the recent trend in terms of security risk is that there have been a sort of an erosion of a rules-based order. There are violations committed by some countries that undermine the economic development of the region. So right now, what the Japanese government is doing is that it is trying to encourage the Trump administration to pursue a positive engagement of the region. I will talk about this later on in more detail. And secondly, to induce China to comply with international rules and norms, and also compel North Korea to comply with the UN Security Council resolution and dismantle its nuclear weapons program. So let me elaborate on three topics: United States, China, and North Korea, in that order. First of all, with regard to United States, we were listening to Mr. Trump's campaign rhetoric during the 2016 presidential elections, and he appeared to be very much not interested in alliance with Japan or other NATO countries. And what we did was we tried to confirm the US defense commitment towards its allies. And Prime Minister Abe was successful in establishing a very good personal relationship with Mr. Trump. And through a series of summit meetings, he was able to secure joint statements that basically reaffirmed existing defense commitments from the United States. This is on the security side. But on the economic side, there are concerns that remain. concern remain with regard to how Mr. Trump will handle the trade issue vis-à-vis Japan, because he is very much obsessed with reducing US trade deficits with its major trading partners, countries like China, countries like Japan, and countries like NAFTA countries. And so we have been watching very closely the Trump administration's policy towards Asia and to the rest of the world. And as you know, Mr. Trump has been using this term called America First. America First. So what does America First mean in US foreign policy? I think it has been translated into two very basic foreign policy goals. The first policy goal is its very strong focus on homeland security and homeland defense. Mr. Trump is very, very much obsessed in protecting the US homeland. And so this has manifested itself in areas of counterterrorism policy, immigration regulation policy, and counter-proliferation policy, which will be translated into North Korea and Iran as well. And also a second goal where the America First notion was translated was the redistribution of trade deficits. Redistribution of trade deficits. This is about the renegotiation of free trade agreements. Free trade agreements. United States is pursuing renegotiation of the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. United States is also trying to renegotiate free trade agreement with South Korea. Another possibility is that they might start talking about concluding a new bilateral trade agreement with Japan, which is something that Japan doesn't want to see happen. So this is, I think, how America First has been translated into the area of foreign policy. So what about America First in Asia policy? America First in Asia policy has been reflected in two lines of policy. One is Trump administration's almost exclusive focus on North Korea. United States is committed to the pursuit of denuclearization. They want to see the North Koreans give up their nuclear weapons. This is a goal that is being shared by China, by South Korea, Japan, and also Russia. We want to see North Korea give up its nuclear weapons. And the United States has reinvigorated its effort to pressure North Korea. And one of the conspicuous characteristics of the Trump administration has been that it has emphasized military action. But we don't want to see military action happen, obviously. But they have been emphasizing this possibility. And now there is the possibility of a new negotiation between Mr. Kim Jong-un and Mr. Trump. I'll talk about this later on when I talk about North Korea. Also, another area is trade, as I said earlier. Mr. Trump withdrew the United States from an agreement, regional free trade agreement called the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And he has opened a renegotiation with the South Koreans about with regard to this chorus, South Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, in the middle of a North Korean crisis. And these developments have been rather disturbing. I think it's a very unorthodox approach towards trade from the United States. So the trend has been that the United States is too narrowly focused. They are only looking at North Korea and trade only, and they are not looking at other issue areas. This was the initial concern that Japan had. Mr. Trump came to Asia in November 2017, last year. And we were looking to see what kind of regional strategy United States will deliver when he came to Asia. And he delivered a speech in Vietnam, about this free and open Indo-Pacific concept. But we were, to some extent, disappointed, because he started talking about trade. only. And he didn't really talk about order, regional order. He didn't express interest in rules and values. And so this kind of created a concern. He didn't even talk about maritime security. So one of the issues for us was to get the United States to be more interested in issue areas other than North Korea and trade. So what did this mean in terms of rules-based order? As I mentioned earlier, there are different rules and issue areas where we want to see stability, where we want to see international cooperation. In the area of non-proliferation, we are already seeing a quite solid coalition of countries trying to advance the cause of denuclearization of North Korea. So this is to some extent okay. Trade rules, as I mentioned earlier, he abandoned the TPP, but he's trying to enforce trade rules against China. But we have to see the way through which he is trying to enforce international trade rules towards China. We don't want to see a trade war happen between United States and China. Thirdly, freedom of navigation is another rule that we want to see underpinned in the region. The United States restarted or regularized what they call the freedom of navigation operation. This is a series of US warships sailing in the Western Pacific region to contest countries that have established excessive jurisdiction over international law. And this is where the United States is working to kind of sustain or enforce international rules and norms. So for these three areas, non-proliferation, trade rules, and freedom of navigation, US is working, right? But in other areas, United States is not so interested. They're not working. For example, maritime security and economic development, like assistance, development assistance, ODA, they're cutting their budget, and they haven't expressed any regional strategy to work on these issue areas. So this is kind of problematic. As I mentioned earlier, countries like China are changing the South China Sea. I will talk about this in my the section about China, on China. So right now, what Japan is trying to do is to trying to elicit US engagement in the region. And we are trying to coordinate Indo-Pacific strategy with the United States. We want to urge the United States to play a positive role and a stabilizing role in the Indo-Pacific region as a close ally. Prime Minister Abe, as I mentioned earlier, has a very good relationship with Mr. Trump. He has been talking a lot with Mr. Trump on many of the East Asian security issues. So we want to kind of convince the United States that there are some positive things that the United States can do in the region. So as I mentioned earlier, there are three pillars in the Indo-Pacific region, the Japanese version of the Indo-Pacific region. We want to kind of sell that idea to the United States. We want to induce the United States to play a positive, stabilizing role in the region. So this is one line of effort. Let me talk about China. China is both an opportunity and a challenge. It has a positive side and a negative side, I must say. I think the Belt and Road Initiative, or the One Belt, One Road Initiative, Japan acknowledges this BRI as a potentially positive driver of economic development of the Indo-Pacific region. However, there have been some very worrying developments with regard to some countries. Certain infrastructure financing and development projects have caused borrowing states to submit economic concessions. Some of you working on South Asian international relations may have heard about the case in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is one of the countries that borrowed money and asked for China's economic cooperation to develop a very big port, seaport, called Hambantota, in the port city of Hambantota. And the Chinese developed a huge port. When Sri Lankans found out that they could not repay China with all the money that they borrowed, China said, okay, let me use the port for 99 years. And China now is able to lease and use the Hambantota port for 99 years. And countries like India are worried that China might potentially use this for military purpose. We have to see how China will use, but it is so massive that it is able to accommodate warships if they make a decision to use it that way. So this is one example where countries that borrow money from China, when they borrow money and find out that they could not repay, they are kind of compelled or sometimes even pressured to give economic concessions in return to China. So what Japan is saying right now is that I think this kind of relationship is not really fair, right? If you lend money to someone and they say they cannot repay, you want to reschedule the payment rather than say, I want you to give me this or that. And so Japan is saying that Japan is willing to cooperate with China on some of the projects, but it has to meet certain conditions. Conditions like openness, transparency, economic efficiency and viability, and financial soundness. So it has to be good for all the countries, not only for Japan and China, but also for the countries that is borrowing or getting the financing. So right now, Japan's approach towards BRI is two-pronged, two-faceted. Number one, to engage BRI, to cooperate with China on some of these projects, on the one hand. But at the same time, if there are countries who decide that borrowing money from China might be very problematic, we want to provide alternatives. Japan, maybe in cooperation with the United States, would like to provide an alternative financing scheme to countries that want to borrow money on a sound condition, on an acceptable terms. So these are the two kind of approaches that Japan is taking vis-a-vis Belt and Road Initiative. With regard to South China Sea, there has been very, very concerning, worrisome developments. Many of you working on international relations in East Asia or Asian studies know that China has been building artificial islands in the South China Sea. And they are moving towards militarizing those islands over the past several years. And this has created a lot of insecurity among regional states, not only Japan, but among other countries. As you can see on the map, on the bottom map, the lower map over here, this is the lines over there are the claims that are made by the different claimant states of the South China Sea. Very, very complex, very difficult, intertwined claims. And I think it's extremely difficult to resolve this problem. But China has went ahead to dig sand from the bottom of the ocean and put it on reefs, to turn reefs into islands and construct bases, military bases on those islands. So let me give you an example, several illustrations over here. This is one of the reefs in the South China Sea. This is one called Subi Reef, one of the reefs in the South China Sea. This is a satellite image, satellite photograph of one of the reefs that China has been working on. In 2012, this was a perfectly natural reef, coral reef, that was in South China Sea. This is only one example among maybe 10 or 12 examples. 3 years later, they started digging sand. And as you can see, some of the white part, that's sand. So they brought sand and land soil and started burying these reefs, burying these reefs. And within approximately 6 months, they started building facilities on these reefs. As you can see, there are buildings on the reefs, and the reefs have completely turned white, as you can see. And this is as of last year. On the left-hand side, you will see a runway that is 3,000 meters, that is capable of allowing any large military aircraft to land. And there are other buildings that facilitate radar facilities and other hangars that are able to accommodate aircraft. And so this is a sort of a development that Japan and other countries in the region have been watching very closely in the South China Sea. Very disturbing, causing a lot of insecurity in the region. Militarization of the South China Sea is an action that China is taking. And this is one amongst, these are several others islands. One is called Fiery Cross Reef on the left-hand side. They also have a 3,000-meter runway. And on the right-hand side, there's an island called Woody Island, also in the South China Sea. So what does this mean on strategic terms? If China continues building these bases or islands in the South China Sea, they will be able to establish military dominance in the Western Pacific. As I told you earlier, there are other countries who have claims in the South China Sea, but China is moving unilaterally. And every time they have an international conference, they want to kind of silence other countries and make other countries not protest against China. And so in one of the very worrisome developments in the South China Sea is the militarization of the South China Sea due to these kind of projects that are advanced by China. Also, in the East China Sea, there have been issues between Japan and China. There is a series of 5 islands called Senkaku Islands. And Japan actually incorporated these islands back in 1895. China started making claims against those islands in the 1970s. And more recently, they have been sending ships into these territorial waters around the Senkaku Islands. And also, we are seeing an increasing number of Chinese military planes coming very close to Japanese territory. And every time there is Chinese aircraft, military aircraft coming in, Japanese Air Force has to go up to do an emergency scramble or intercept and send these Chinese military aircraft away from Japanese airspace. So as you can see on this chart, back in 2008, it was only 31 incidents, 31 cases. But last year, 2 years ago, 2016, it's 851 cases. So there were 851 instances where Chinese military aircraft was coming close to Japanese airspace. We feel very coerced by this kind of Air Force activities. And so what Japan has been doing is to kind of bolster our defense against this kind of incursion. So as you can see, there is this security competition that is happening in the South China Sea on the one hand, and also in the East China Sea on the other hand. These are some of the major security risks that is unfolding. And we also see that China's way of lending money to other countries is also causing some economic statecraft concerns in the Indo-Pacific region. Lastly, let me talk about North Korea. When it comes to North Korea, there are 3 different types of problems. Number 1, obviously, is the development of nuclear weapons. It was initiated earlier, much earlier, even before the end of the Cold War. We went through a series of crises with regard to North Korea nuclear weapons development. In 1994, there was what we call the agreed framework, where North Korea promised that it will not develop nuclear weapons. And they accepted economic assistance. And we thought the nuclear weapons issue with regard to North Korea was basically resolved. However, in 2002, it became apparent that North Korea had a secret nuclear weapons development program. They were advancing what we call the uranium enrichment type nuclear weapons development program. And that caused another series of crises, which led to what we call the 6-party talks And in 2005, North Korea came to an agreement that they will give up its nuclear weapons program. But again, they started nuclear weapons test and missile test, and so the agreement was put aside. And more recently, with the new leader, Mr. Kim Jong-un, the number of nuclear tests and number of missile tests have been increasing dramatically over the past 2 or 3 years. And this has caused a lot of concern, not only in Tokyo, but also in South Korea, and also in China. China is very, very disturbed by this kind of North Korean behavior. And obviously, the United States and Russia are also concerned with this problem. So right now, what the major countries as well as other countries are doing is to impose sanctions on North Korea through the United Nations. I think this is very important. United Nations Security Council is the main venue where all the countries agree on sanctions against North Korea. And also there are other national efforts to impose sanctions on North Korea. I'm sorry, let me go back a little bit. I also have to mention that North Korea has had a history of abducting Japanese nationals and also South Korean nationals. Abduction is kidnapping Japanese people from the Japanese territory and taking them back to North Korea, unwillingly, unforcibly. And this is also a major problem for Japan. And due to these kind of problems, countries like Japan and the United States and other countries have taken sanctions against North Korea as well. Also, in addition to sanctions, we are also instituting defensive measures against North Korea. North Korea has been launching missile tests in a very dangerous manner. They have been shooting above Japanese airspace, and they have been taking very provocative actions. Back in 2011, they attacked South Korean ships, and they also attacked the South Korean island back in 2011 called Yeonpyeong-do. And so in order to defend against these North Korean military provocation, we have been bolstering our defense capabilities vis-a-vis North Korea to tell North Korea that military action is not going to solve the problem. Now, this kind of pressuring of North Korea, not only by United States, Japan, or South Korea, but also by China. China is now also in the sanction coalition. This kind of multinational effort has pressured North Korea to start talking about negotiations. We are expecting 2 major summits in the following next 2 or 3 months. First summit is between North Korea and South Korea, Mr. Moon Jae-in and Mr. Kim Jong-un. This is expected to be held sometime in April, next month, perhaps. And we have to see what kind of agreement North Korea and South Korea will have. And then if there is positive development, I think there could be a US and North Korea summit meeting as well between Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim Jong-un. We don't know whether that will happen or not, but it has become a possibility right now. Why is North Korea doing this so suddenly? They have suffered 20 years of sanction to develop nuclear weapons. Once they have nuclear weapons, they say, we are ready to give up. Is it easy to believe that they will give up everything they built through all the suffering over the past 2 or 3 decades and suddenly come to the table and give up everything? Very hard to believe. So I think there are 2 possibilities, 2 different scenarios. One scenario, or one possibility, is that this is a sort of a optimistic scenario, is that Mr. Kim Jong-un has reached the conclusion that developing nuclear weapon is not going to help North Korea in the future. And so he's sincerely going to give up nuclear weapons in return for some economic incentives, a normalization of relations. This is one optimistic scenario. I think it's a little bit naive. I'm not in favor of this scenario. Another scenario, more pessimistic scenario, is that Mr. Kim Jong-un's calculation is that he will continue negotiating. He will pretend as if he is ready to give up nuclear weapons. prolong the negotiation, make the negotiation long, while continuing to develop nuclear weapons. Because negotiation does not stop the development of nuclear weapons. And the more nuclear weapons he has, the more bargaining chip he will have. So that possibility is still there. We don't know what's going to happen, but we have to find out by speaking and talking with the North Koreans. But I personally believe that it will take a very, very long time for North Korea to actually come to a conclusion that they're ready to give up nuclear weapons. But I don't know. Anything could happen. North Korea could give up its nuclear weapons. But they are not going to give up nuclear weapons for free, right? They will demand return. What is that return going to be? One of the possibility is that they will demand the withdrawal of US troops from South Korea. So they will say, since I am giving up our nuclear weapons, I want safety. In order to get my safety, I want US forces off the Korean Peninsula. I think this could be a demand from North Korea. Would that be acceptable to South Korea, Japan, United States, and other countries? I'm not quite sure. We'll have to see what kind of bargaining will go on. But that is the kind of negotiation that we have to see how it unfolds in the coming months and years. Another very difficult point about negotiation, is verification. If North Korea is going to promise that it's going to give up nuclear weapons, we have to know that they are really giving up nuclear weapons. We have to know for sure that North Korea has gotten rid of all their nuclear weapons. Because as I said earlier, North Korea said, we'll give up nuclear weapons, and they cheated 2 times. So we have to be sure that we have a very, very effective verification mechanism to see or to make sure that North Korea is fulfilling its promises. But verification mechanism is very, very difficult. I'm sure you've seen through the Iraq case, right? Iraq says, I don't have nuclear weapons. But US could not believe because they were so insecure, right? Verification issue is a very, very difficult issue. And so that is also going to make any sort of a negotiated deal very, very difficult. But anyhow, we have to see what goes on between the United States and North Korea, as well as other countries as well. Lastly, with regard to North Korea, I want to point out, what are the risks of North Korea acquiring nuclear weapons? What is going to happen once North Korea acquires operational nuclear capability that is capable of striking continental United States? That is a very, one of the main issues that defense experts are working or thinking about in Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul. One of the dangers is that if North Korea makes 2 misperceptions or miscalculations, there could be a very grave risk of conventional war in Northeast Asia. One type of miscalculation is that North Korea might believe that once they have nuclear weapons, they can deter United States. They might believe that having maybe 5 or 6 or 10 nuclear weapons or maybe 20 nuclear weapons will stop United States from taking military actions against North Korea. This is one sort of belief that North Korea might have. A second type of misperception that North Korea might have is that North Korea might believe that Japan and South Korea will no longer trust the United States because North Korea will be capable of attacking United States. In other words, North Korea will believe or start thinking that Japan and South Korea will think that the United States will not protect Japan and South Korea because they don't want to be retaliated by North Korean nuclear weapons. And as a result, Japan and South Korea might become submissive to coercion by North Korea. So if you have these 2 kind of North Korean belief, if North Korea believes that they can deter US military action, and if North Korea believes that South Korea and Japan will be submissive to North Korean coercion, they might come to the conclusion that North Korea can coerce Japan and South Korea by military action, start a sort of a low-intensity military action against South Korea and Japan. And this is the kind of misunderstanding or misperception that could heighten the risk of war in Northeast Asia. So what we want to do is to try to minimize this kind of risk. We want to try to tell the North Koreans that using military force is not going to make the situation any better. So in order to convince North Korea that military action is not going to work, we are also taking defensive measures against North Korean capability, North Korean nuclear and conventional capability. So these are some of illustrations of some of the long-range missiles that North Korea is developing. One called Hwasong-15 is capable of reaching continental United States. It's able to hit, probably strike Washington, D.C. And if they have that kind of capability, it kind of raises the risk of miscalculation by North Korea. And this is very worrisome, very worrisome. So in conclusion, let me conclude by making, kind of summarizing some of the points that I made. I think there is a very big opportunity for economic development in the Indo-Pacific region, very big opportunity in the Indo-Pacific region. But there are security risks emanating from Chinese action in the South China Sea, East China Sea, as well as North Korea's nuclear weapons development. If there is some sort of a war or risk of war in Northeast Asia, it's going to affect not only economies of Northeast Asia, but if Japanese, South Korean, Chinese economy, and also US economy is affected by a North Korean crisis, it will have a global implication in terms of economic growth. So that is why we are very serious about North Korean issue and China's issue. If there is a lot of security competition in East Asia, it will hinder cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region, and it will undermine economic development of the Indo-Pacific region. So what Japan wants to do is to minimize security risks, take efforts to minimize all the security risks, and at the same time maximize opportunities for economic growth by trying to cooperating with both China and other countries, and the United States and other countries, to foster economic growth in the region. And right now, Japan is sort of beginning to launch this Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And as I said earlier, this is a very inclusive concept. We want to invite all the countries that want to advance economic development in this region and foster economic growth in the region to join in advancing a rules-based order. We also want to have other countries cooperate in minimizing security risks. We want to try to convince North Korea that developing nuclear weapons is not going to help the world. It's not going to help North Korea or the world. And we want to also persuade China that the unilateral actions in some of the South China Sea islands and East China Sea is not going to also help, because it's going to make cooperation between Japan and China and other East Asian countries and China very difficult. So I hope this evolving concept of Indo-Pacific strategy will move towards a very positive direction. But I will also say, as an international relations scholar, that we cannot ignore some of the very serious security risks that we are trying to cope. And I hope this kind of understanding will also be shared with our friends in North Africa, including our colleagues in Algeria. So thank you very much. I'll stop here.
أريغوتو شكرا مرة أخرى للأستاذ موري ساتوري من الجامعة اليابانية. طبعا حاول في هذه المحاضرة أن يؤكد حول إشكالية معينة، هي كيفية استيعاب المنطقة في استراتيجية اليابانية تتجه نحو الاقتصاد والنمو الاقتصادي، بعيدا عن الرؤية الموجودة في محيط الباسيفيكي المتعلقة بمحاولة الصين ممكن وروسيا وأيضا كوريا الشمالية عسكرة المنطقة. يقول أن لدينا القدرة ولدينا الخبرة كذلك بالنسبة للسياسة الخارجية اليابانية فيما يتعلق بالطاقة والتكنولوجيا، ونحن نمد يدينا في هذه المنطقة للاستمرار في عملية التنمية والتوجه الاقتصادي. ويقول بأن هذه الاستراتيجية اليابانية تقوم على التعاون المشترك لتحقيق الأمن والسلام، وكذلك الالتزام بالقانون الدولي، وعلى التعاون مع القوى المحبة للسلام في العالم. طبعا يقول بأن هناك تحديات تجاه الاستراتيجية اليابانية. هذه التحديات ذكرها في علاقة الصين باليابان، وفي علاقة كوريا الشمالية باليابان، وفي المواقف تجاه بعض القضايا المتعلقة بآسيا. قد نتفق معه وقد نختلف معه، وأستاذي الأستاذ إسماعيل دبش له ما يقول في هذا المجال خاصة متعلق بالصين وكوريا. وفي النهاية قال بأن رغم هذه التحديات الأمنية الكبيرة المتجهة نحو عسكرة المنطقة، إلا أنه فيه فرصة أمام الاستراتيجية اليابانية إذا التزمت القوى الباسيفيكية الهندية بالقانون الدولي وبالتوجه نحو النمو، وهذا يؤدي إلى في النهاية إلى استعادة المنطقة للسلام واستعادة إلى التشاركية في المجال الاقتصادي. أشكر الجميع على الانتباه وعلى الحقيقة كانت محاضرة قيمة استفدنا منها كثيرا. أتيح المجال الآن إلى أستاذي الدكتور إسماعيل دبش له كلمة في هذا الموضوع. سنتيح النقاش بعد ذلك للجميع.
Mr. Ali has summarized what you have said, but I would like to make some comments.
Okay, sure.
China is no longer China of the 60s and the 70s. But Japan is still the same. That means Japan hasn't changed. Still hold the same view about China as they are talking about the Japanese foreign policy towards China in the 60s. Whereas now Japan has 35 companies and enterprise Japanese working in China. So I think to make your policy based on US strategy towards China will not be positive for the Japanese strategy for the long term. Why? Because United States uses its policy of pressure towards China, whereas Japan needs the security. That's the difference. Japan needs the security and peace in the region, whereas the United States uses it just to pressurize China to gain more for national or for economic interests. So the difference, this is one thing. Second thing which I would like, قلت له للأسف أن اليابان ما زالوا ينظروا للصين وكأنهم في الستينيات، والصين مش تاع الستينيات. الستينيات راهي الآن قوة أولى، وبجانبكم وعندكم 35,000 شركة موجودة فيها في اليابان، ولهذا لازم تغيروا الاستراتيجية، ما تبقاوش تعتمدوا فقط على أمريكا، لأن أمريكا تستعمل في هذه فقط من أجل تحقيق مصالحها الخاصة مع الصين وليس من أجل السلم في المنطقة. The second thing which I would like to talk about is, does USA have the same view as you have today? I don't think so. I don't think USA have the same view as you said of the United States. From your intervention, I can get that you trust U.S. policy towards the Pacific region. Maybe strategically speaking, I would go even further. Maybe for the United States, North Korea is more important than Japan. We don't know. Maybe they have in dealing with a strategy, it doesn't mean your enemy is against your interest. Maybe it's good for your interest because of North Korea. All the countries now are armed, buying arms from the West. So thank you very much, North Korea. So we shouldn't just make it just an enemy is an enemy. The third thing قلت له ليس بالضرورة أن كوريا الشمالية أنها عدو لأمريكا من حيث المصالح، بالعكس أن شكرا إلى كوريا الشمالية بفضلها استطاعت أمريكا أن تضغط على اليابان وكوريا الشمالية يشتروا الأسلحة. إذا لو ما كانش اليابان كوريا الشمالية ما يشتروش الأسلحة هذو. إذا شكرا إلى نورث كوريا. النقطة الأخرى which I would like to emphasize is we have to create scholars. I think this is what lacks in Japan, lacks in China, lacks in North Korea. Scholars. I mean, there are a lot of scholars who have liberal attitudes towards the area, whether in China or in North Korea. I met some scholars from North Korea don't have the same view as you. It's seen in the North Korea foreign policy. They have critical view. So why don't we scholars, you scholars in Japan, China, and create cohesive view rather than I don't know, promoting the official politics of our governments, which I can grasp from your lecture. You are really more official rather than presenting an academic approach. I mean, you have been saying about my government, the prime minister, etc., which we don't use it in our scholars. We just say Algeria, we don't say governments. So to me, we have to promote scholarship approaches. I myself produced with limited arguments, but I might go further in the future with a Japanese, Kiyosaki, a book about Japan and Algeria. But based on our academic approach rather than أنا قلت له المداخلة نتاعك فيها الرسمي أكثر منها الأكاديمي. وأنا قلت له مع ياباني اللي هو كيوساكي درت معه كتاب مؤخرا على اليابان. مقاربة تاعي كانت مقاربة أستاذ جامعي، ما قلتش الحكومة الجزائرية أو الدولة الجزائرية، قلت له لازم نطوروا المدارس في اليابان في كوريا الشمالية وفي في الصين، وما نبقاوش فقط نديروا التشهير فقط للحكومات نتاعنا. كاين ناس اللي عندهم مقاربات نقدية حتى في الصين، مقاربة نقدية في كوريا الشمالية ومقاربة نقدية في اليابان. Thank you.
شكرا دكتور اسماعيل.
I just ask you one question about there is some tension between North Korea and the United States of America, and there will be
my knowledge that Japan is a committed to military and political process. What I see, North Korea became a nightmare to Japan in 2000. Korea became a nightmare. But we don't try to open the people-to-people diplomacy, because as I know, there's a very organized North Korean community in Japan. We try to reduce these tensions and to bridge the gaps, and you might find solutions rather than relying on the United States.
Professor of Japan, we are really glad to meet you in our university. My question is the following, system speaking. I wonder if Japan only can play an important leader role in third countries like Algeria by investing, supporting and advising them to avoid financial crisis without dealing with IMF in the context of the core reforms that this international economic organization has to initiate to keep stability in the global economic political system, including Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
give me this opportunity to ask you a simple question. Is that, as I know, after during the Cold War, Japan was in the second place in the international economic relations. So I'd like to know why, during the globalization, after we are underneath the U.S. authority, I'd like to know why Japan is getting backwards and place is taken by China. Can you give us, please, some kind of... Thank you very much.
You mentioned in your talk that North Korea was launching missiles over Japanese spaces, and Japan will really prepare itself for that. Does it mean we will be armed? Does it mean we will change the Article 9 of the Constitution, or we change all the Constitution, and we will...
Okay, thank you very much for the excellent comments and questions. I really appreciate it. First of all, with regard to our professor's comment, if I may respond, with due respect, I respect your position as a senior Asian scholar, so, Japanese scholars' culture, but with due respect, if I may, I'd like to respond to your comments. With regard to China policy, I must say that there is actually a difference between Japan and the United States. For example, when you look at the Obama administration period, Japan was very much alarmed by Chinese action vis-à-vis the Senkaku Islands, because China was making these intrusions into the Senkaku Islands. And we wanted the United States to take a tougher line against China, but Obama said, no, I'm going to take a cooperative approach. This was during Obama. So Japan was hard line, United States was soft line. Right now, this changed. Mr. Trump is taking a much more harder line towards China, as you know, because of North Korea's also trade. He is becoming, his national security strategy that came out in December 2017 is a very, very competitive worldview with both China and Russia. So United States is becoming a very hard-line approach towards China. But now Japan, there is this new momentum to improve relationship with China. And so we are now looking towards realizing Japan, South Korea, China summit, trilateral summit. We want to see Prime Minister Abe go to Beijing to have a summit meeting with Mr. Xi Jinping. And next year, we are hoping that Mr. Xi Jinping will come to Tokyo to kind of improve relationship with China. So there is this slight difference between Japan and the United States when it comes to China. I think Japan has been more clear about its willingness to cooperate with China on economic development and cooperation, as I mentioned earlier. So, there is this difference between Japan and China. There is close coordination. As you know, there is this close consultation between Japan and the United States. And we tend to be said, why is Japan following the United States all the time? And I know that that image is quite widespread, but I have to say, from a Japanese scholar watching Japanese government policy making, that Japan has its own thinking to calculate what is best, what is in the best interest of Japan, not in the best interest of the United States. So we have this independent thinking behind Japanese foreign policy. So we cooperate with the United States where we can, but we do take attitudes that are different from the United States, yeah. Secondly, I think with regard to North Korea policy, I think, Professor, you mentioned that to the United States, North Korea is a sort of a convenient target to keep up tension. Yeah. I think that was your point. I think we have a different view, as we discussed earlier. I think North Africa and East Asia, we see different faces of the United States. I think in the Middle East and North Africa, United States has a long history of using force. Yes? I think that's a long history of using.
More force in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yes, in the Second World War, yes. And after the Second World War, we entered the Cold War. Yeah. And for the security, for Japan's security, we don't have the luxury of distancing from United States because we face security challenges from North Korea, China, and during the Cold War, Soviet Union. So this has sort of developed a new kind of relationship with the United States after the war. And as a result, we tend to see that the United States is the only security provider for the defense of Japan. We can't depend on China for our security because we have conflicting interests, security interests. Although we want to improve relationship with China, we have been doing that for the whole time. But I think from Japan's point of view, as an ally of the United States, we tend to see a more sort of a, how should I say, a security providing role rather than a sort of a use of force aggressor type of image. So I think there is this sort of a difference in view of how we see the role of the United States in different regions of the world, because we have different histories. And I completely appreciate how North Korea and Middle East see the United States, because I know the history. There is a long history of using force, overturning governments, and intervening in a very aggressive manner. I know that. So we have different conceptions or images of the United States, but I have to convey as a fact, not as a propaganda or anything, as a fact that the United States generally in East Asia has been playing a sort of a stabilizing role as a security provider. So I hope it remains that way. We want to keep the United States to play a stabilizing role rather than an aggressive role. So if the United States starts talking about military action against North Korea, I think Japan will oppose, quite frankly. I think we should apply pressure, but if there is war on the Korean Peninsula, yes. So we will play that positive role, I think. And I think what United States does best is not use force, but form coalition to tackle issues like the Cold War, like the Soviet Union, right? The Cold War ended without a Third World War because the United States was successful in building a coalition. But I think that kind of shows when they intervene in Vietnam, it's a disaster, right? Whenever they use force, there has been a lot of problem. But I think the US is not really good at that type of intervention. But in any case, I have to underline the fact that in East Asia, the United States has been seen as a sort of a stabilizing role. And not only Japan, but also other countries see the United States in that image. On your third point about scholars, I'm not trying to engage in any propaganda or anything, right? I try to be as objective. I try to find what the problem is from a scholarly point of view. And we do have academics and also policy research-based work among academics, and try to determine what the relative interests are, what the different goals are, and so forth. So I'm actually scheduled to go to Beijing next week to talk with Beijing University scholars. Whenever I speak with Chinese scholars, there are agreements. There are positive things that where we can agree with. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that internationalist scholars who can meet us, meet you, meet me, are very internationalist. But there are people in the center of Chinese government and center of North Korean government who have a very different worldview, I think. Sometimes they are very hard-lined. They have a different ideological mindset. So I think I completely agree with the professor that we should try to spread this kind of internationalist outlook among academics into our respective countries so that there is more confluence of views. Great, wonderful. And with regard to the question on North Korea and United States, Kim Jong-un and the Trump administration talks, we just don't know what is going to come out. As I mentioned earlier, there's two possibilities. One is that if Mr. Kim Jong-un is really committed to giving up nuclear weapons, there might be a true negotiation about what is going to be the quid pro quo, sort of a deal, transaction. So North Korea will say, I will give up nuclear weapons, but I want to have the United States withdraw US forces from South Korea. I'm not quite sure whether that kind of deal will actually be established because there are many skeptics in the United States about the potential agreement with North Korea. And also with regard to verification mechanism, as I mentioned earlier. How do you make sure that North Korea is fulfilling the promise of giving up nuclear weapons? You have to have a verification mechanism. You have to have teams go into North Korea and check that North Korea is really dismantling and giving up nuclear weapons. Can they agree on the terms of the verification mechanism? This is going to take a long time. So in any case, if there is a Trump-Kim summit in April or May this year, it's not going to solve the problem suddenly. I think there's going to be, if there is a sincere effort on both sides to achieve denuclearization, even if there is a sincere motivation, I think it's going to take a long time to work out all the conditions necessary not only for the roadmap towards denuclearization, but also for the verification mechanism. So roadmap for denuclearization and verification mechanism. These are the two issues that will require a very tough negotiation between not only North Korea and United States. United States will consult with other countries. And China will also be advising North Korea, I think. So there's going to be a very complex interaction among all the major players concerning the Korean Peninsula. Professor's question about people-to-people exchange. I agree. I think if there's a possibility between improving relationship, Japan and North Korea has had this diaspora, North Korean diaspora in Japan for a long time. And we've been trying to solve, for example, the abductee issue that I mentioned through negotiation. And we asked the North Korean authorities to do an investigation. And North Korea said yes. And they agreed to do the investigation. But after more than several years, we haven't heard from them. So that kind of difficulty sometimes make it very difficult to sort of advance a positive sort of a mood or atmosphere for further negotiation between Japan and North Korea to kind of develop. With regard to nuclear weapons and missile tests, I think it's sometimes very difficult for the people-to-people level to have any effect on the government level. As you know, North Korean regime has its own system where the people do not have direct influence over the leader. So in that respect, I think although we want to sort of keep a positive relation on the people-to-people level, it's sometimes very difficult to kind of leverage that to solve government-to-government level issues like nuclear weapons and missile tests. Yeah, thank you. For the comment on Japan-Algeria relations, I think there's a new potential project by Japan to invest and develop more on the car manufacturing companies, major Japanese car manufacturing companies to build companies in Algeria. And I think if we can develop sort of expand the relationship by having a new sort of auto industry investment in Japan, like Toyota and other countries, other companies, I think that will help advance or kind of thicken the relationship between Japan and Algeria. And I hope there is further economic cooperation. And I think we can go beyond economic cooperation and also talk about educational and academic exchange between Algeria and Japan. Yesterday, I was attending a reception at the Japanese embassy, and this year, 5 students are actually going to study in Japan at Japanese universities and Japanese graduate schools. And I think this kind of intellectual exchange should continue to develop people who can serve as sort of bridges between Japan and Algeria. So I think those are positive momentums that could help us expand Japan-Algerian relations. With Professor's question on Japan-China's economic position, why did the change happen? Yeah. I don't want to be too critical on China, but China has been making very, very impressive economic growth. I think the way they have achieved economic growth is by connecting their economy to the global economy. They joined the WTO in 2001, I think. I think the accession came into effect. And since then, they have been promoting trade and various kinds of international economic activities overseas. But at the same time, there are some questions about intellectual property, for example. I hear from Japanese company people that when they want to build factory in China, for example, computer companies, China says, if you want to do business in China, you must give us the technology information. And this is quite intrusive, as you can imagine. And this happens not only to Japan, but also to other companies, other countries' companies as well. And so we have been trying to help China sort of grow economically. But at the same time, I think the time is coming where we want to see China take a sort of comply more with international economic rules. Economic growth is something that countries can't stop easily. It's not about trying to stop other countries from growing economically. Every country has the right to economic growth. And so, we've been working very hard to be competitive in the international market. But I think China has this advantage of a scale of economy. They can invest more money and speed up various kinds of investment. And so that's provided China with the economic impetus to kind of overtake Japan as number 2 and becoming number 2 economy by themselves. Yeah. On the last point about Japan's constitutional revision, Professor's question. The Prime Minister wants to revise the Constitution, Article 9, but the purpose is not to achieve security policy purpose. The purpose is to inscribe the Japan Self-Defense Force's place in the Constitution. Right now we have Article 9, Section 1 and Section 2, and Section 2 says we will not possess any armed forces. And this does not reflect the reality of Japan, because Japan does have self-defense force. Japanese self-defense force currently, in legal terms, is an administrative body. And constitutionally, it's not an armed force. So the new proposal right now is to add a Section 3 to Article 9. This is the Liberal Democratic ruling party's proposal, I think. Well, they're actually working on it. And to put a clause that will recognize the legitimate constitutional place of the Japan Self-Defense Force in Article 9. And in order to achieve this, there is this procedure for constitutional amendment, but it's a very high hurdle. I think it requires voting not only in Diet, but also a national referendum that requires something like 2/3 of the Diet members to support, and then have over majority of the national Japanese general population to support the amendment. But the purpose is not to kind of bolster Japanese self-defense. We have already done that through the security legislation revision in 2015 by allowing Japan to exercise what we call collective self-defense. But the current debate about Article 9 is about actually reflecting the reality of the Japan Self-Defense Force to constitutional revision. And we have to see whether Prime Minister Abe and the Liberal Democratic Party will be able to build up significant or sufficient support in the Diet. Because the opposition party is opposed to constitutional revision. And there needs to be a lot of work and negotiation before any constitutional revision can be realized. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for such a brilliant intervention.
Thank you.
Frank.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think your comments and responses were very directed to academic approach.
Thank you.
We end up, before I say, before I the lecture, give a gift to Mr. Satoru. I would like to say that Japan has a special place in Algeria, because despite Japan was the ally of the West, Japan opened its doors to the Algerian FLN in 1958. And whenever we had problems or earthquakes, Japan was present here in Algeria. So that's why if we criticize Japan, because we like Japan, not because we have something different from Japan. Thank you.
الآن نكرم الأستاذ ساتوري موري بدرع الجامعة باسم السيد رئيس الجامعة الدكتور رابح شريط.
أعطيها له تاني ولا؟ أنا بالعامل. لا.
Thank you so much.